The torch sputters and dies in his trembling hand, and Orpheus lets it fall. He watches the flame tumble down, down, down into the impossible depths below, until it becomes nothing more than a pinprick of light, then vanishes entirely into the throat of the earth. He does not need it anymore. Where he is going, no mortal light can follow. The darkness that swallows him now is not the darkness of night, not the simple absence of sun. This is the darkness that existed before the world was born, the darkness that waits beneath every living thing, patient and absolute. His footsteps echo against stone that has never known warmth, and the air grows thick with the breath of the dead. Somewhere far above, the living world continues. Somewhere, spring still comes. But here, in these descending tunnels that spiral toward the center of all endings, there is only the sound of his lyre and the question that drives him forward like a blade pressed against his spine. What would you sacrifice to undo death itself? Orpheus was not always a man haunted by impossible grief. Once, he was simply the greatest musician who ever lived. When his fingers touched the strings of his lyre, stones wept. Rivers changed their course to hear him better. Trees uprooted themselves and followed the sound of his music like pilgrims seeking salvation. Wild beasts laid down beside their prey, predator and victim alike transfixed by melodies that seemed to come not from human hands, but from the very fabric of creation itself. The muses themselves claimed him as their son, and there were those who whispered that even Apollo, god of music, felt a twinge of envy when Orpheus played. But all that power, all that divine gift, meant nothing when he held Eurydice's cooling body in his arms, and understood for the first time that there are forces in this world that do not bow to beauty. No song could restart her silenced heart. No melody could bring color back to lips that had turned blue with venom. A serpent hiding in the grass on their wedding day. One bite, one moment of inattention. That is all it takes for love to become lost. Most men, broken by such grief, would have buried their beloved and learned to carry the weight of absence. Most men would have accepted what the gods and fate had decreed. But Orpheus was not most men, and his love was not a thing that could be reasoned with or diminished. So he made a choice that would echo through the ages as a warning, as a tragedy, as a testament to the dangerous mathematics of devotion. He decided to go where the living do not go. He would walk into death itself and demand her back. The entrance to the underworld waits in a cave that even shepherds avoid, where the rocks themselves seem to exhale cold breath and the shadows move against the light. Here, Orpheus begins his descent. Down through caverns that narrow and twist, through passages slick with water that has never seen sky, past the river Styx where Charon the ferryman watches with eyes like chips of flint. The dead crowd the far shore, pale and whispering, but Orpheus does not join them. He plays, and his music transforms the impossible into passive. Even death must pause and listen. Deeper still, past the three-headed hound Cerberus, who guards the gate with jaws that have tasted the blood of would-be heroes. The beast snarls and lunges, but Orpheus draws from his lyre a lullaby so sweet, so achingly tender, that all three heads lower to the ground, and the monster sleeps like a puppy dreaming of forgotten kindness. Now he stands before the throne of Hades himself, Lord of the Dead, and beside him Persephone, Queen of the Underworld, who knows something of being stolen from the world above. The court of the dead falls silent. Shades and spirits press close to witness this audacity, this living man who dares to make demands in the House of Endings. Orpheus does not beg. He plays. His music becomes grief made audible, love transformed into sound. Every note carries the weight of Eurydice's laugh, the warmth of her hand in his, the future they will never have. He plays their wedding day and the serpent's strike. He plays the emptiness of their bed, the silence of their home. He plays what it means to love something so completely that the world without it becomes unlivable. And in that throne room where nothing has wept for eons, tears begin to fall. The Furies, ancient and pitiless, cover their faces. Persephone reaches for her husband's hand. Even Hades, who has seen every mortal tragedy, who has welcomed every death since time began, feels something crack in the fortress of his eternal heart. The king of the dead makes an offer that has never been made before, and will never be made again. He will release Eurydice. She may follow Orpheus back to the world of the living, back to sunlight and seasons and all the gifts of mortal life. But there is a condition, and it is this condition that will poison everything. Orpheus must walk ahead, and he must not look back. Not once. Not until both of them have emerged completely from the underworld and stand together beneath the open sky. Only then can he turn and see her face. Until that moment, he must trust. He must have faith. He must walk forward into light and believe that she follows. It is a test, perhaps, or a cruelty, or simply the price that the powers of the underworld exact for breaking their most fundamental law. The dead do not return. But if Orpheus can master himself, if he can resist the most human of all impulses, the desperate need to verify what we cannot see, then love will have conquered death. He agrees. What choice does he have? And so begins the ascent, the long climb back through the darkness. Orpheus in front, Eurydice somewhere behind. He cannot hear her footsteps. The dead make no sound. He has only the word of Hades, only faith to sustain him as he climbs. The path seems longer going up. Every step is an agony of doubt. Is she really there? Did Hades deceive him? What if she stumbled? What if she cannot keep pace? What if he emerges alone and discovers he has been climbing toward nothing but renewed grief? The silence behind him becomes a torture more exquisite than any physical pain. His fingers ache to reach back. His neck strains with the effort of not turning. Every instinct screams at him to verify, to confirm, to look. And ahead, impossibly, he begins to see light. Real light. The light of the living world. He is almost there. Almost free. Just a few more steps, and they will both be saved. His heart hammers with hope so violent it feels like dying. But he has not yet emerged. Not completely. The threshold beckons, and in that final moment, with salvation so close he can taste it, something breaks inside him. Perhaps it is love. Perhaps it is doubt. Perhaps it is simply the unbearable human need to see what we are told to trust. For just one instant, Orpheus forgets himself, forgets the bargain, forgets everything but the overwhelming need to know that she is there. He turns. He sees her. Eurydice, pale and beautiful, reaching for him with love and longing written across her face. Their eyes meet. For one heartbeat, they are together again. Then the underworld claims what it was promised. She is ripped backward, vanishing into darkness like smoke scattered by wind. He hears her cry his name, or thinks he does. And then there is only silence and the knowledge of what he has done. The deal is broken. Death does not negotiate twice. Orpheus returns to the world alone, carrying a grief heavier than the one he descended with, because now it is mixed with the poison of self-betrayal. He destroyed the only chance they had. In the single moment that mattered most, he was weak. This is where the story begins. With a man who loved so much, he dared the impossible, and lost everything in one glance. In the shadows of ancient Thrace, where the rough mountains meet dark forests, and the Hebrus River winds through deep gorges, there existed a tradition of worship that predated even the classical Greek pantheon. Within these wild lands, mystery cults flourished in ways that made the sophisticated Athenians uncomfortable, practicing rituals that seemed to tap into something older, something more primal than the orderly religion of the city-state. And at the heart of these mysteries stood a figure whose influence was so profound, whose legend became so intertwined with the very foundations of Greek religious thought, that scholars today debate whether Orpheus might have been more than mythology. He may have been flesh and blood, a real man whose charisma and abilities were so extraordinary that his followers elevated him to divine status long after his death. The historical evidence is fragmentary, frustratingly incomplete, yet tantalizingly suggestive. References to Orphic mysteries appear throughout classical literature, always spoken of with a mixture of reverence and unease. These were not the public ceremonies of mainstream Greek religion, celebrated in marble temples under the Mediterranean sun. The Orphic rites took place in darkness, in caves and hidden groves, where initiates learned secret knowledge about the nature of the soul, the structure of the cosmos, and the possibility of escaping the endless cycle of death and rebirth. The fact that these mystery religions centered around the name and teachings of Orpheus suggests a founder of remarkable power, someone who had genuinely touched something beyond normal human experience. According to the ancient sources, Orpheus was born of bloodlines that transcended mortality entirely. His father was Apollo himself, the god of light, music, prophecy, and divine order. His mother was Calliope, the greatest of the 9 muses, she who inspired epic poetry and eloquent speech. This was no ordinary divine parentage, no casual liaison between an Olympian and a mortal woman. Both parents represented the highest expressions of artistic and intellectual achievement in the Greek understanding of the cosmos. From Apollo, Orpheus inherited not just musical talent, but the ability to channel divine force through sound, to make his art a bridge between the mortal and immortal realms. From Calliope came the gift of language that could move souls, words that carried weight beyond their mere meaning. The lyre that Orpheus carried was said to be a gift from Apollo himself, crafted with such perfection that it became an extension of the musician's soul. When his fingers touched its strings, the sound that emerged was unlike anything produced by mortal hands. Ancient writers struggled to describe it, reaching for metaphors that could capture something fundamentally beyond normal sensory experience. It was music that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to the deepest parts of consciousness, resonating with frequencies that affected not just emotion, but the very fabric of physical reality. The accounts of what Orpheus could accomplish through his music read like fever dreams, yet they appear too consistently across too many independent sources to be dismissed as simple embellishment. Wild beasts, creatures driven by hunger and instinct, would abandon their prey and gather peacefully around him when he played. Wolves lay down beside deer. Mountain lions forgot their savage nature and became tranquil as domestic cats. Birds would cease their own songs to listen, filling the trees in such numbers that the branches bent under their weight, creating a living canopy of silent, attentive witnesses to his performance. But the animals were only the beginning. Trees themselves, rooted deep in the earth for decades or even centuries, would tear their roots from the soil to move closer to the source of that divine sound. Imagine the ground splitting, the earth heaving, as ancient oaks and towering pines dragged themselves across the landscape, like slow pilgrims drawn to a holy site. The image is disturbing in its impossibility, in its suggestion that the fundamental laws of nature could be suspended by the power of Orpheus's art. These were not gentle, magical transformations from children's tales. These were violent disruptions of natural order, the world itself bending and breaking to accommodate a power it could not resist. Rivers, too, felt the influence of his music. According to legend, Orpheus could make flowing water reverse its course, sending streams backward uphill, forcing currents to abandon their ancient channels and carve new paths through stone and soil. Water, which flows always downward following the inexorable pull of the earth, would defy gravity itself when Orpheus played. Think about what this suggests about the nature of his power. He was not merely creating beautiful sounds. He was imposing his will on reality, commanding the elements themselves to obey patterns that existed only in his music. Some ancient sources claim that even the rocks and stones would move in response to his playing, arranging themselves into new formations, creating structures that seemed almost deliberate in their design. This detail, mentioned almost casually by classical writers, hints at something even more unsettling. If Orpheus could command inanimate matter, if his music could reach into dead stone and force it to dance, what did that mean for the nature of consciousness itself? Was everything in the world somehow alive and listening, waiting for the right frequency to awaken it? The Greeks who recorded these stories were not naive. They understood metaphor and allegory. Yet they spoke of Orpheus's powers with a consistency and seriousness that suggests they believed something genuinely extraordinary had occurred. The philosopher Pythagoras, himself a historical figure of unquestioned existence, was said to have studied the Orphic mysteries. He founded his own cult based partly on Orphic principles, teaching that music and mathematics were fundamental to the structure of reality. If Orpheus was pure invention, why would serious philosophers build real teachings on his foundation? There is something deeply unsettling about the figure that emerges from these accounts. This was not a benevolent saint using his gifts only for good. The power Orpheus wielded was fundamentally transgressive, a violation of boundaries that were meant to remain inviolate. He was a being who existed between categories that should not overlap: mortal and divine, living and dead, human and force of nature. His very existence represented a kind of cosmic error, a glitch in the proper order of things. The Thracian mystery cults that venerated Orpheus developed practices that shocked and disturbed outsiders. They spoke of reincarnation and the transmigration of souls centuries before such ideas became commonplace in Greek philosophy. They claimed special knowledge about the journey of the soul after death, secret passwords and rituals that could grant safe passage through the underworld. They taught that the physical body was a prison, that earthly life was a punishment for ancient sins that predated our current existence. These were not comforting doctrines. They painted reality as fundamentally hostile, a trap from which only secret knowledge could provide escape. Initiates into the Orphic mysteries underwent experiences that changed them profoundly. Ancient accounts speak of ritual deaths and rebirths, of descents into underground chambers, where participants confronted their own mortality in darkness and sensory deprivation. Some historians believe in theogens, psychoactive substances derived from plants and fungi, played a role in these initiations. The experience was meant to be transformative and terrifying, breaking down the initiate's normal consciousness to make room for something else, some direct perception of the hidden machinery of existence. What kind of historical figure could inspire such devotion, such elaborate ritual practice? The mystery cults were not casual social clubs. They demanded genuine commitment, real sacrifice. People joined them because they believed, because they had experienced something that convinced them the Orphic teachings contained authentic truth. At the center of it all was the figure of Orpheus himself, whose music was said to have revealed the structure of reality, to have made audible the hidden harmonies that underlie all existence. The most telling detail about Orpheus's power was this: his music could affect not only the living world, but the realm of death itself. This was his most transgressive ability, the one that marked him as truly dangerous. Death was supposed to be final, absolute, a boundary that could not be crossed. But Orpheus's music suggested otherwise. It hinted that perhaps death was not an ending, but merely another condition of existence, one that could potentially be negotiated with, maybe even overcome, by someone with sufficient knowledge and power. The ancient Greeks, who told Orpheus's story, understood that they were describing something that should not exist, a violation of cosmic law. Yet they could not dismiss him as fantasy, because too much evidence suggested a real origin, a genuine historical cult leader whose abilities transcended normal human limitations. Whether through shamanic trance, divine ancestry, or some combination of both, Orpheus had accessed something beyond ordinary consciousness. He had learned to use sound as a tool to reshape reality itself, and in doing so, he had become something more and less than human. He was a figure of wonder, yes, but also of profound unease. A reminder that there might be powers in the world that humanity was never meant to wield, and that some individuals, through gift or curse, might wield them anyway. The morning of their wedding day arrived with the kind of brightness that seemed designed by the gods themselves. Sunlight spilled across the rolling hills of Thrace like liquid gold, warming the olive groves and setting the wildflowers ablaze with color. Orpheus stood at the center of the celebration, his lyre cradled against his chest, and for once in his life, he wasn't thinking about music. He was watching Eurydice. She moved through the crowd of wedding guests like a vision from another world, her gown flowing around her ankles in waves of pristine white linen. The fabric had been woven by the finest craftswomen in the region, each thread infused with prayers for fertility and happiness. Garlands of myrtle and roses crowned her dark hair, the traditional symbols of Aphrodite's blessing. Her laughter rang out above the murmur of conversation, clear and bright as mountain water, and every time Orpheus heard it, something in his chest tightened with a joy so intense it bordered on pain. The celebration had begun at dawn, as was customary. Eurydice's family had presented her to Orpheus with all the proper rituals, reciting the ancient formulas that bound two souls together in the eyes of both mortals and immortals. Blood offerings had been made to Hera, the protector of marriage. Wine had been poured into the earth for Hestia, goddess of the hearth and home. Everything had been done correctly, every tradition honored, every deity acknowledged. The couple had spoken their vows before witnesses, their voices steady and sure, and the crowd had erupted in jubilation. Now, as the sun climbed higher in the cloudless sky, the wedding feast was in full swing. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, honeyed cakes, fresh bread still warm from the ovens, and amphoras of wine that seemed to multiply magically as the day wore on. Musicians played, though not as skillfully as Orpheus himself, their flutes and drums creating a lively backdrop to the celebration. Children darted between the adults, shrieking with laughter, their hands sticky with fruit and sweet wine. Old men argued good-naturedly about politics and farming, while women clustered in groups, offering advice to the new bride about managing a household and pleasing a husband. Orpheus couldn't stop touching Eurydice. His hand found hers constantly, fingers intertwining, thumb brushing across her knuckles. When they were separated by well-wishers pressing cups of wine into their hands or pulling them into dances, his eyes tracked her across the gathering, unable to look anywhere else. He had written songs about love before today, countless ballads and odes that had moved audiences to tears, but now he understood with crystal clarity that he had known nothing. All those verses had been guesses, shadows of the real thing. This feeling, this overwhelming tenderness mixed with desire, mixed with a protectiveness so fierce it was almost violent. This was what the poets had been fumbling toward all along. Eurydice felt it too. He could see it in the way she kept glancing at him, even when speaking to someone else. In the flush that rose to her cheeks when their eyes met across the crowd. In the way she leaned into him when he stood beside her, fitting against his side as if she'd been made to match his contours exactly. The afternoon wore on in a haze of wine and music and joy. Orpheus played his lyre finally, unable to resist, and the celebration fell silent in awe as his fingers drew forth melodies that seemed to make the very air shimmer. He sang about love found, about two hearts becoming one, about the blessing of the gods on their union. Birds landed in the nearby trees to listen. The wind itself seemed gentle, as if afraid to disturb the music. When he finished, there wasn't a dry eye among the guests, and Eurydice was weeping openly, tears streaming down her face as she smiled at him with such radiant happiness that he felt he could die in that moment and consider his life complete. But not everyone at the celebration was moved by joy. At the edge of the gathering, partially concealed by an ancient oak, stood Eurystheus. He was a minor god, son of Apollo and the nymph Cyrene, known for his skills in beekeeping and olive cultivation. He had been invited to the wedding as a courtesy, his divine blood demanding recognition, but his presence had gone largely unnoticed until now. He stood rigid as carved marble, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, watching Eurydice with an intensity that would have alarmed anyone who noticed. Eurystheus had seen Eurydice before this day. He had encountered her in the fields where she liked to walk, had observed her tending to her father's sheep, had watched her singing to herself as she gathered wildflowers. Each sighting had fed an obsession that grew like poison ivy in his mind, spreading and choking out reason. He had convinced himself that she was meant for him, that her beauty had been created specifically for his enjoyment, that her marriage to a mortal musician, even one as gifted as Orpheus, was a cosmic mistake that needed correcting. As the afternoon began, its slow descent into evening, Eurydice slipped away from the celebration. The wine and heat and endless conversation had left her flushed and slightly dizzy. She needed a moment of quiet, a chance to catch her breath and let the reality of the day settle into her bones. She was married now. She belonged to Orpheus, and he to her. The thought filled her with a happiness so complete it frightened her slightly. Nothing this perfect could last, surely. Some part of her mind whispered warnings, old superstitions about tempting fate, about joy that climbed too high. She made her way toward the meadow that stretched beyond the olive grove, a place she had loved since childhood. The grass there grew tall and sweet, dotted with flowers that attracted butterflies and honeybees. She could still hear the celebration behind her, the music and laughter drifting on the warm air, but the sounds were muted now, softened by distance. Her wedding dress whispered against the grass as she walked, the hem already stained green from the day's activities. Eurystheus watched her go. His pulse quickened. This was the opportunity he'd been waiting for, though he hadn't known he was waiting until it appeared. The celebration would continue for hours yet. No one would notice their absence, not immediately. He could speak to her, make her understand. convince her that she had chosen wrong. His divine heritage gave him certain rights, didn't it? Mortals existed for the pleasure of the gods. Everyone knew this. Eurydice's marriage was a formality that could be undone. He followed her into the meadow, his footsteps silent on the grass. Eurydice didn't hear him at first. She was tilting her face up to the sun, eyes closed, breathing deeply. The myrtle crown sat slightly crooked on her head now, and there was a wine stain on her sleeve. She looked more beautiful than ever, flushed, and real, and thoroughly alive. When she finally sensed his presence and turned, her expression shifted from peaceful contentment to confusion, then to the first flicker of unease. Aristeus was looking at her in a way that made her skin crawl, his eyes moving over her body with an ownership that had no basis in reality. He spoke to her, his voice thick with wine and want. The exact words had been lost to history, but their meaning was unmistakable. He wanted her. He intended to have her. Her marriage meant nothing to him. She belonged to him by divine right. Eurydice's fear crystallized into something sharp and cold in her chest. She took a step backward, then another. She told him no. Told him she was married. Told him to leave her alone. But Aristeus kept advancing, reaching for her, his face twisted with an entitlement that recognized no boundary. She ran. The decision was pure instinct, her body moving before her mind could fully process the danger. Her wedding dress, so beautiful and carefully made, became an impediment immediately. The long skirts tangled around her legs, the delicate fabric catching on thorns and branches as she fled deeper into the meadow. She could hear Aristeus behind her, his footsteps heavy, his breathing labored. He was calling her name, his voice swinging between pleading and anger. Eurydice's heart hammered against her ribs. The meadow, which had always seemed friendly and safe, had transformed into a maze of obstacles. She stumbled over hidden roots, nearly fell, caught herself, and kept running. Tears blurred her vision. She wanted Orpheus, wanted to be back at the celebration surrounded by people and safety. She wanted this to not be happening, not on this day of all days, not when everything had been so perfect. She didn't see the serpent until it was too late. It lay coiled in the tall grass, basking in the late afternoon warmth, invisible against the earth. Her foot came down directly beside it, and the creature reacted with the pure reflex of a threatened animal. It struck fast, fangs sinking into her ankle just above the delicate sandal strap. The pain was immediate and shocking, like being stabbed with hot iron. Eurydice cried out and fell, her hands sinking into the grass. The serpent slithered away, its warning delivered, disappearing into the undergrowth. For a moment, Eurydice simply knelt there, stunned. Then she looked down and saw the twin puncture marks, already swelling, already leaking blood. The venom worked quickly. She could feel it spreading up her leg, a burning sensation that climbed toward her knee, her thigh, moving with horrifying speed through her bloodstream. Her breath came in short gasps. The meadow began to tilt and blur around her. She tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't support her weight. She collapsed fully then, the white wedding dress spreading around her like petals. Aristeus had stopped running when he heard her scream. Now he approached slowly, and when he saw what had happened, the color drained from his face. This wasn't what he had intended. This wasn't supposed to happen. He stood frozen, watching Eurydice writhe in the grass, and then, like the coward he was, he turned and fled, leaving her alone to die. Back at the celebration, Orpheus felt it. He couldn't explain how or why, but something in him knew that the world had just tilted on its axis. One moment he was laughing with a group of friends, and the next, a cold dread was washing over him, making his hands go numb. He set down his cup and began walking toward the meadow, then running, his feet carrying him forward with increasing urgency. He found her lying in the grass, her skin already pale as milk, her lips taking on a bluish tinge. The wedding crown had fallen from her head and lay beside her in the dirt. When she heard him approaching, she turned her head slightly, and the expression in her eyes broke something fundamental inside him. Orpheus dropped to his knees beside her and gathered her into his arms. Her body was trembling, convulsing slightly as the venom continued its terrible work. He could see the bite marks on her ankle, could see the black tendrils of poison spreading beneath her skin like dark lightning. His mind raced through everything he knew about healing, about herbs and antidotes, but even as he thought it, he knew it was too late. The venom was too strong, had spread too far. Eurydice tried to speak, but only managed a whisper. She said his name. She said she was sorry, as if any of this was her fault, as if she had anything to apologize for. Orpheus pulled her closer, cradling her against his chest, and for the first time in his life, his gift for words completely abandoned him. He could only repeat her name, over and over, a prayer and a plea and a denial all at once. She died in his arms as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that would forever after seem obscene to him. Her final breath was so soft he almost missed it. Just a small sigh, and then she was gone. The light went out of her eyes. Her body went still. The woman he had married that morning, the woman who had promised to spend her life with him, was dead before their wedding day had even ended. Orpheus's cry of anguish rang across the meadow and reached the celebration beyond. It was a sound of such pure, concentrated grief that it seemed to tear a hole in the fabric of the world. The music stopped. The laughter died. People began to run toward the sound, but when they arrived and saw Orpheus kneeling there, Eurydice's body limp in his arms, they stopped short. There was nothing to be done. Nothing to say. The joy of the day had curdled into tragedy so complete, so sudden, that it seemed like divine punishment. This was the man who could charm stones and tame wild beasts with his music. The man whose songs could make rivers change their course and trees pull up their roots to follow him. The man blessed by Apollo himself with a gift that transcended mortal understanding. And yet when it mattered most, when the woman he loved more than life itself lay dying in his arms, all his power meant nothing. He couldn't sing death away, couldn't play a melody that would draw the poison from her veins, couldn't bargain or plead or charm his way out of this moment. The cruel irony would haunt him for the rest of his days. He who would later descend into the underworld itself, who would face down Hades and Persephone and nearly succeed in bringing Eurydice back from death, couldn't prevent death from taking her in the first place. All his gifts, all his divine favor, all his talent and skill, and he had arrived mere moments too late to save her. The gods, it seemed, had a vicious sense of timing. The southernmost tip of the Peloponnese thrusts into the Mediterranean like a jagged finger pointing toward the realm of the dead. The ancient Greeks called this wind-swept promontory Cape Teneron, and they believed it to be one of the few places on Earth where the boundary between the living world and the underworld grew thin enough to cross. Here, where limestone cliffs plunge into dark waters and caves honeycomb the coastline, Orpheus came seeking what no mortal had ever successfully reclaimed, a soul already claimed by death. The cave mouth yawned before him like a wound in the earth itself. Unlike other caves that might offer shelter or shade from the Mediterranean sun, this opening seemed to actively repel light. Shadows pooled at its entrance with an unnatural thickness, and the darkness beyond appeared almost solid, as though you could reach out and touch it. The rocks surrounding the entrance were smooth, worn by countless centuries of seawater and something else, something the locals refused to name but could feel in their bones whenever they passed too close. Orpheus stood at the threshold, his lyre clutched against his chest. The instrument that had charmed beasts and bent trees to listen now seemed fragile, almost childish in the face of what lay ahead. But it was all he had. His voice and his music were the only weapons he carried into the land of the dead. The first thing he noticed as he stepped into the cave was the silence. Not the peaceful quiet of a forest glen, or the hushed reverence of a temple, but an absence so complete it seemed to press against his eardrums. No birds sang near the entrance to the underworld. No insects chirped or buzzed. Even the sound of the sea, so present just moments before, faded to nothing, as though the waves themselves dared not disturb this threshold. The silence had weight and texture. It was the silence of tombs, of sealed chambers where air had not moved in generation. With each step deeper into the cave, the temperature dropped. The warmth of the Greek sun became a memory, replaced by a chill that had nothing to do with the absence of light and everything to do with proximity to death itself. The air tasted wrong on his tongue, thick with minerals and decay, with the metallic tang of blood long dried and something sweeter, more cloying, like flowers left too long on a grave. He could feel the weight of the earth above him, millions of tons of rock and soil pressing down, and deeper still, the accumulated weight of all the dead who had passed through this gate before him. The tunnel descended steeply. The floor was worn smooth by the passage of souls, and Orpheus had to brace himself against the walls to keep from sliding into the darkness ahead. His fingers touched wetness on the stone, but when he pulled them away, he could not tell if it was water or something else. The cave swallowed all light, all warmth, all hope. Time ceased to have meaning in the descent. He might have walked for minutes or hours. The darkness was so complete that his eyes, straining to find any reference point, began to create their own light, phantom shapes and colors that swirled across his vision. He kept one hand on the cave wall and moved forward, deeper, always deeper, into the earth. Then he heard it. The sound of water, but not the cheerful babble of a stream or the crash of ocean waves. This was a slow, thick sound, like oil pouring over stones, like something ancient and patient that had been flowing since the world began. The river Styx, the boundary that separated the world of the living from the realm of the dead. The tunnel opened into a vast cavern, and though no sun had ever penetrated this deep, a dim phosphorescent glow emanated from the walls themselves, from fungus or mineral deposits, or perhaps from the river itself. The light was cold and gray, the color of corpses, but after the absolute darkness of the descent, it seemed almost bright. The river Styx stretched before him, wider than any river he had seen in the world above. Its waters were black and moved with a sluggish current that suggested tremendous depth. Mist rose from its surface, coiling and twisting into shapes that almost looked human before dissipating into the cave air. The smell of decay grew stronger here, mixed with something else, something that made his throat close and his eyes water. This was the water that the gods themselves swore their most binding oaths upon. To touch it uninvited meant death, or worse, a half-life of suffering that made death seem merciful. On the near bank, pulled up onto the rocks, sat a boat. It was ancient beyond reckoning, its wood gray and rotted looking, yet somehow still sound. The craft was long and narrow, built to ferry souls across the black water, and standing beside it was Charon. The ferryman of the dead was impossibly old. His face was so lined and weathered it resembled driftwood, carved by centuries of wind and water into something barely human. His eyes were pale, colorless, filmed with cataracts, or with seeing too much suffering for too long. He wore robes that might once have been white, but had long since faded to the same gray as everything else in this realm. In his gnarled hands, he held a pole taller than himself, dark with the waters of the Styx. Charon looked at Orpheus with those terrible pale eyes and shook his head slowly. His voice, when it came, sounded like stones grinding together deep beneath the earth. No living soul crosses in my boat. This is the law. Go back to the sunlight, mortal. Your time here will come soon enough, as it comes to all. Do not hasten it with foolishness. Orpheus stepped forward, close enough now that he could see the water dripping from Charon's pole, see the way it steamed slightly as it hit the stone. He lifted his lyre and began to play. The music that flowed from his fingers was unlike anything he had played before. Above, in the world of light and life, his songs had been beautiful, had spoken of love and loss and longing. But here, in the realm of death, his music transformed into something more primal, more true. He played grief itself. He played the sound of a heart breaking, of love ripped away, of the desperate howling emptiness that Eurydice's death had carved into his soul. Every note was a wound, every chord a cry of anguish that echoed through the cavern. And Charon, who had ferried the dead for longer than human memory, who had seen empires rise and fall, who had grown so callous from his eternal task that he barely registered the souls as they stepped into his boat, felt something he had not experienced in eons. A tear formed in the corner of one pale eye, and traced a path through the dust on his ancient cheek. The ferryman's hand trembled on his pole. He tried to speak, to refuse again, but the music wrapped around him, filling the empty spaces that countless ages of death had hollowed out inside him. It reminded him of things he had forgotten, of a time before this duty, before the endless crossing and recrossing of the river Styx. It reminded him of what it meant to feel. "Get in," Charon whispered. his voice thick with something that might have been sorrow. "Get in the boat, living one. I do not know what will come of breaking this law, but I cannot deny what your music has shown me. Get in." Orpheus stepped into the boat, feeling it rock beneath him. The wood was cold and slightly damp, and when he settled onto the narrow seat, he could feel how many souls had sat here before him, could almost sense their terror and resignation soaked into the grain. Charon pushed off from the shore with his pole, and they moved out into the black water. The crossing was silent, save for the soft splash of the pole and the creaking of the ancient boat. Mist surrounded them, thick and clinging, obscuring both shores. Orpheus kept his eyes forward, not daring to look into the water, where legend said the faces of the dead swam just below the surface, mouths open in silent scream. The far shore emerged from the mist gradually, a beach of gray sand that looked like it had never known the warmth of sun. Orpheus stepped out of the boat onto that lifeless shore, and Charon pushed away immediately, eager to be gone from the one who had made him remember, made him feel. Beyond the beach, a path led through a grove of leafless trees, their branches twisted and black against the gray light. And there, at the end of the grove, the path passed through a gate of tarnished brass. Before that gate, lying across the path, with his 3 massive heads resting on enormous paws, was Cerberus. The hound of Hades was larger than any living creature Orpheus had ever seen. Each of his 3 heads was the size of a bull, with jaws that could crush stone and teeth like daggers. His eyes glowed red in the dim light, 6 pools of molten hatred fixed on the approaching mortal. His body was muscled like a lion's, built for power and violence, and his tail was not a dog's tail, but a living serpent that hissed and struck at the air. Cerberus's sole purpose, his only function in all of creation, was to guard this gate. The dead could enter freely, but none, living or dead, could leave. The hound had stopped escape attempts beyond counting, had torn apart shades who thought they could slip past in the confusion of new arrivals, had driven back the few bold or foolish living mortals who had made it this far. All 3 heads growled in unison, a sound that shook the ground beneath Orpheus's feet and seemed to vibrate in his chest. The sound was a warning and a promise. Come no closer or be destroyed. Orpheus's fingers found the strings of his lyre. He was exhausted from the descent, shaken from the crossing, terrified of the monster before him. But Eurydice was beyond that gate. His love, his wife, his reason for breathing, was somewhere in the vast realm that lay past this final guardian. He would not turn back. He could not. He played softness, gentleness, the kind of melody a mother might hum to soothe a crying infant. He played comfort and safety, rest after long labor, the deep satisfaction of lying down after endless wakefulness. The music drifted through the grove, wound around the massive hound, caressed those 3 terrible heads. Cerberus fought it. His growls intensified, his claws gouged furrows in the stone beneath him. But the music was relentless, patient, kind. It asked nothing, demanded nothing, only offered peace. One by one, the glowing eyes began to dim. One head yawned, displaying rows of teeth that could rend a man to pieces. Then another. The serpent tail ceased its angry striking and began to sway gently with the rhythm. Slowly, like a mountain settling, Cerberus lowered his heads. His eyes closed. His breathing deepened and slowed. The eternal guardian, who had never slept, who had never rested from his duty, surrendered to the music and to dreams. What a creature like Cerberus might dream of, Orpheus could not imagine and dared not wonder. He stepped carefully past the sleeping hound, so close he could feel the heat radiating from that massive body, could smell the scent of sulfur and old blood that clung to its fur. He passed through the brass gate, feeling it swing open at his touch with a groan of ancient hinges. Beyond lay the underworld proper, the realm of Hades, the kingdom of the dead. The laws of the living world, already strained in the descent, ceased entirely here. Orpheus had crossed into death itself, and there would be no returning unchanged if he returned at all. The Greeks did not imagine hell as a place of fire. There were no flames licking at the feet of the damned, no lakes of molten sulfur, no demons with pitchforks administering punishment. Their vision of the afterlife was something far more terrifying in its simplicity, something that struck at a deeper fear embedded in the human heart. The Greek underworld was a realm of forgetting, an endless gray plain where color itself had died, where even suffering eventually faded into a numb, eternal twilight. To understand why Orpheus's journey was not merely difficult, but fundamentally wrong, why his request violated the very structure of existence, you must first understand the absolute nature of Death's kingdom. Imagine descending through the earth itself, past the roots of mountains, past the buried cities of forgotten civilizations, down through layers of stone and darkness, until you emerge into a vast cavern that stretches beyond all horizons. This is the realm of Hades, and the first thing that strikes you is the absence. There is light here, but it is weak and gray, emanating from no visible source, casting no shadows, because the shades themselves are shadow. The air, if you can call it that, hangs heavy and still. Nothing moves except the endless procession of the dead, and they move slowly, as if walking through water, as if the very atmosphere of this place resists motion, resists change, resists anything that might suggest life. The newly dead arrive at the river Styx, where Charon the ferryman waits in his ancient boat. Those who are buried properly, with coins placed upon their eyes or tongues, can pay their passage. Those who were not must wander the shores for 100 years before Charon will grant them crossing. But crossing to what? The far shore offers no paradise, no reward, only entrance into the fields of Asphodel, where the vast majority of human souls will spend eternity. The fields of Asphodel stretch endlessly in every direction, a plain of ghostly flowers that release no scent. These pale blooms are the only vegetation in the underworld, and they grow in infinite profusion, a carpet of colorless petals beneath colorless skies. Here wander the ordinary dead, those who were neither heroic enough for Elysium, nor wicked enough for Tartarus. They are the merchants and farmers, the mothers and fathers, the children who died too young, the elderly who faded peacefully in their sleep. In life, they were individuals with names and stories, loves and hatreds, dreams and disappointments. In death, they are shades, mere echoes of personhood. Walk among them, and you will see the truth of what death meant to the Greeks. These shades are not quite conscious. They drift through the asphodels with vacant eyes, moving without purpose, existing without truly being. If you were to call out a name, the shade might turn toward you with dim recognition, might mouth words that produce no sound, might reach out translucent fingers that pass through everything they touch. The Greeks believed that without blood to animate them, without the warm, vital fluid of life flowing through veins, the dead could not truly think or feel. They were memories of people, not people themselves. They had forgotten who they were, and the living would eventually forget them in turn. This was the fate that awaited everyone. Hero or coward, wise philosopher, or simple peasant, all paths led to the fields of Asphodel, unless your deeds in life were truly extraordinary. The Greeks found no comfort in death, no promise of reunion with loved ones in any meaningful sense. When Eurydice died, she did not go to a place where she could wait for Orpheus. She went to a place where the very concept of waiting would slowly dissolve from her mind, where her memories of music and love and sunlight would fade like morning mist, where the woman Orpheus loved would become a hollow thing that wore her shape but no longer contained her essence. In the distance, beyond the endless gray fields, you can see Tartarus. It rises, or perhaps descends, into view like a wound in the fabric of the underworld itself. The Greeks placed their hell not above in the gray plains, but below them, a deeper pit within the pit, as far beneath Hades as the earth is beneath the sky. Here the truly wicked suffer, and their torments are visible from the fields of Asphodel, perhaps as a reminder, perhaps simply because in the geography of the dead, all things are exposed. You can see Tantalus standing in his pool, reaching for fruit that withdraws from his grasp, bending to drink water that recedes from his lips, eternally hungry and thirsty. You can see Sisyphus pushing his boulder up an impossible slope, muscles straining, the stone always rolling back just before he reaches the summit. You can see the Danaids pouring water into jars with no bottoms, trying to fill vessels that can never be filled. These punishments are not random cruelties. They are eternal because the crimes they answer were crimes against the cosmic order itself. Tantalus killed his own son and served the child's flesh to the gods, testing their omniscience. Sisyphus cheated death, binding Thanatos in chains so that no mortal could die, disrupting the fundamental cycle of existence. The Danaids murdered their husbands on their wedding night, spilling the blood of those to whom they owed sacred bonds. Each punishment fits its crime with terrible precision, an eternal consequence for a violation of eternal law. Between the fields of Asphodel and the pits of Tartarus stand the judges of the dead. Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus were kings renowned for their wisdom and justice in life, and in death they were given the terrible responsibility of weighing every soul that enters Hades. The newly dead come before them, still confused by their transition, still clinging to their memories and identities. The judges see through all pretense, all self-deception. They know every deed, every thought, every moment of cowardice or courage. Their verdicts are absolute and cannot be appealed. To Elysium for the heroic few, to Tartarus for the truly damned, to the fields of Asphodel for all the rest. But at the center of this gray kingdom, there is one place where color still exists. The palace of Hades and Persephone rises from the Asphodel plain like a dark jewel, its walls of polished black stone shot through with veins of silver. Here the god of the dead holds court, and here his queen, stolen from the world of light, brings the only warmth that exists in this cold realm. The throne room is vast and austere, but it is not entirely lifeless. Persephone, daughter of Demeter, goddess of spring who must spend half of every year in darkness, has brought with her what she can of the upper world. In the throne room, pomegranate trees grow, their fruit blood red against the darkness. These trees should not exist here, cannot exist anywhere else in the underworld, but Persephone's presence allows it. Flowers bloom in obsidian vases, their colors muted but still present, pale roses, white lilies, purple crocuses. The throne of Hades is carved from a single piece of black adamant, unbreakable and eternal as death itself. Beside it sits the throne of Persephone, made of silver and decorated with living vines that twist around its arms and legs. Between them burns a brazier, and the light from those flames is warm and golden, the only warm light in all the underworld. Here Hades rules with absolute authority, not as a devil, but as a god whose domain is as necessary as any other. He is stern and unyielding, but not cruel without cause. His realm follows laws as fixed and immutable as the laws that govern the stars in their courses, the seasons in their turning, the tides in their rising and falling. And the most fundamental of all these laws is simple. The living cannot enter the realm of the dead, and the dead cannot leave it. This is not arbitrary. This is not divine whim or jealous possessiveness. This is the law that holds the cosmos together. Life and death are not opposites in the Greek understanding. They are halves of a whole, two sides of a whole, two sides of a cycle that must remain in balance. If the dead could return to life, if the boundary between the two realms could be crossed at will, then existence itself would unravel. The seasons would lose their meaning. Time would become meaningless. The very structure of reality depended on death's permanence. There were stories, of course, of those who had tried to cheat this law. Sisyphus had succeeded temporarily, chaining death itself, and the chaos that resulted was catastrophic. Warriors died in battle, but could not die, suffering endless agony with wounds that should have been fatal. Old age could not claim the elderly, leaving them trapped in failing bodies that could not release them. Disease spread without the mercy of death to end suffering. The gods themselves intervened, freed Thanatos, and made an example of Sisyphus that would last for all eternity. The message was clear: death is not negotiable. Others had descended to the underworld while still alive, but always with divine permission and always for purposes that served the cosmic order. Heracles came as one of his labors, sanctioned by Zeus himself, to capture Cerberus and prove his worthiness for immortality. Theseus and Pirithous attempted to descend without such sanction, planning to kidnap Persephone, and they paid dearly for their presumption. Pirithous remains trapped there still, seated on the chair of forgetfulness, his flesh merged with the stone, his mind slowly dissolving into nothing. Theseus was rescued only through the intervention of Heracles, and divine mercy he scarcely deserved. The underworld accepts visitors when it must, when the will of the greater gods requires it, but it does not release the dead. That is beyond even the power of Zeus. Death is the one thing from which even the king of gods cannot grant exemption. When Asclepius, the great healer, learned to raise the dead through his medical arts. Zeus struck him down with a thunderbolt. The crime was not healing but resurrection, not saving lives but reversing death itself. It could not be permitted. It violated laws older than the Olympians, laws woven into the fabric of being. This is the realm Orpheus would dare to enter. This is the law he would dare to challenge. When he descended into Hades with his lyre, when he stood before the thrones of the god and goddess of death, when he played his music and made his request, he was not simply asking for a favor. He was not pleading for mercy or clemency. He was asking the gods to undo death itself, to reverse the irreversible, to break the fundamental law that kept the cosmos from collapsing into chaos. He was asking them to take a shade that had already drunk from the river Lethe, that had already begun to forget herself, that had already been judged and assigned her place in eternity, and restore to it life and memory and substance. He was asking for the impossible, and more than impossible, the forbidden. The descent had ended. Orpheus stood in the throne room of the underworld, his living breath an anomaly in the realm of endless silence. The palace of Hades stretched before him, carved from obsidian and stone, that seemed to swallow light itself. Columns rose like the bones of titans, disappearing into a darkness that had no ceiling, no end, only absence. This was the heart of Death's kingdom, and he had come bearing nothing but strings and wood and the desperate weight of love. Before him sat the god and goddess of the dead, Hades upon his throne of black iron, his form both there and not there, as if he existed in the space between one breath and the next. His face bore the features of his brothers, Zeus and Poseidon, yet time had eroded something essential from it. Wherever joy or fury might have lived in those features, there remained only patience, the infinite patience of one who knows that all things, eventually, come to him. Beside him sat Persephone, queen of shadows, daughter of spring trapped half her life in eternal autumn. Her beauty carried the strange duality of her existence. Flowers wilted in her presence, even as they bloomed, a crown of pomegranate blossoms resting on hair dark as rich earth. The throne room was not empty of other witnesses. The Furies stood in the shadows, their serpentine hair coiling restlessly, their eyes burning with the cold fire of vengeance. These were the Ancient Ones, older perhaps than Hades himself, daughters of night who pursued the guilty through eternity. Their hands dripped with the blood that never dried, their wings rustled with the sounds of screams carried across ages. They had seen every mortal who ever lived pass through these halls, had judged every crime, had measured every soul. Nothing moved them. Nothing touched whatever hearts beat in their terrible chests. Around the periphery of the great hall, shades gathered. The recent dead, still remembering the weight of flesh. The ancient dead, worn thin as gossamer by centuries. They assembled to witness this unprecedented thing, this living man who had walked breathing into their breathless realm. Some had been heroes once. Some had been monsters. Death made equals of them all, and now they watched with eyes like holes in fabric, waiting to see what the god of death would do. Hades spoke first, his voice the sound of earth settling over a coffin lid. He asked why a living man stood before him, what madness or hubris had driven Orpheus to violate the oldest boundary, the line between life and death that even gods respected. There was no anger in his question, only genuine curiosity. In all his eons, how many had tried to retrieve a loved one from his keeping? A handful. Most turned back in fear long before they reached these depths. Those few who persisted were usually dispatched by his guards, sent back to join the dead properly, their shades joining the very ones they sought to rescue. Orpheus did not speak in answer. Words were too small for what he carried. Instead, he lifted his lyre, that instrument blessed by Apollo himself, strung with chords that sang with divine resonance. His fingers found the strings, and he began to play. The first notes fell into the throne room like stones into still water, and silence rippled outward from them. It was not a loud music. Orpheus did not assault the ears of gods with thunder and spectacle. Instead, he played softly, intimately, as though he sat beside a sickbed in the deep of night, offering comfort to a sufferer who could not sleep. The melody began simply, almost a lullaby, the kind a mother might hum to a child. Then his voice joined the strings, and the song began in earnest. He did not beg. Begging implied that Hades had something to prove, that mercy needed to be extracted through groveling and tears. Instead, Orpheus sang of cosmic truth, of the fundamental laws that governed existence itself. He sang of love, not as a soft thing, not as flowers and sweet glances, but as a force as undeniable as gravity, as necessary as breath. Love, he sang, was the power that held the stars in their courses, that drew spring from winter, that called life from death, in every seed that split the soil. It was the engine of creation, the reason anything existed rather than nothing. His fingers moved across the strings with increasing complexity, weaving harmonies that should not have been possible for 10 fingers alone. The music seemed to multiply itself, each note giving birth to echoes that harmonized with what came after. He sang of Eurydice, but not as a eulogy. He described her life, the particular way light caught in her hair, the sound of her laughter, specific and real. He sang of her hands moving through tasks, threading a loom, breaking bread, reaching for his face in the dark. He sang her into presence there in the throne room, made her so real through music that the shades leaned forward, searching for her form among them. Then his song turned to the manner of her death, and the music bent with anguish. The serpent in the grass, the venom racing through her veins, the shocked recognition in her eyes that her time was ending. Here, now, with no warning, no preparation, no chance to say the 1,000 things still unsaid, Orpheus sang of the unnaturalness of young death, how it violated the proper order of things. Old age was natural, expected, a fruit falling when ripe. But Eurydice had been spring itself, cut down before her summer, before her harvest, before the fullness of her years. She belonged to the world above, to sunlight and growth and the continuation of life. Her death was not justice. It was chaos, randomness, the cruel accident of being in the wrong place when the serpent struck. As he sang these words, the music carried them deeper than meaning usually goes. The notes bypassed thought entirely and spoke directly to something older, the part of consciousness that recognizes truth without needing proof. In the shadows, the Furies felt something they had not experienced since their own creation. Their eyes, which had remained dry through countless ages of suffering, began to glisten. One by one, tears formed and fell, hissing as they struck the stone floor. The serpents in their hair grew still, entranced. The blood on their hands ceased its eternal dripping, frozen by the power of the song. The music spread beyond the throne room, seeping through the passages and caverns of the underworld, like water finding every crack and hollow. In the fields of Asphodel, where the ordinary dead wandered in endless twilight, the shades paused in their aimless drifting. For the first time since their deaths, they felt something. Sorrow, yes, but also remembrance. A sudden sharp recollection of what it meant to be alive, to love, to lose. Some wept, though tears from shades were strange, thin things. Others simply stood transfixed, letting the music wash over them like rain they could no longer feel. Deeper still, in Tartarus, where the wicked suffered their eternal punishments, the music penetrated even there. Sisyphus, condemned forever to push his boulder up the slope only to have it roll down again, felt his muscles strain as always, felt the stone's impossible weight bearing him backward. But then the music reached him, and something unprecedented happened. The boulder stopped. Halfway up the slope, it simply ceased its rolling, became truly still for the first time since his sentence began. Sisyphus stood frozen, hands still pressed against the rock, and listened. For a moment that existed outside of time, his punishment paused. Tantalus, standing in his pool with fruit hanging just beyond reach, forgot his eternal hunger and thirst. Ixion's burning wheel slowed, stopped, released him from its spin. The vultures tearing at Prometheus's liver lifted their beaks and cocked their heads, listening. All torment ceased. The machinery of eternal justice ground to a halt, overcome by something stronger than divine retribution. In the throne room, Orpheus sang on. His song shifted now to address the nature of love and death themselves. Death, he sang, was necessary, even beautiful in its way. The god Hades was not evil, but essential, the keeper of boundaries, the final rest. Without death, nothing would have meaning. Every moment would lose its preciousness if moments were infinite. He honored this, acknowledged it, sang of death's dark majesty with genuine reverence. But love, he insisted through melody and verse, was death's equal, not its servant. Where death separated, love united. Where death ended, love persisted. The love he bore for Eurydice had not died with her body. It lived still, as strong as ever, perhaps stronger and absent. This love transcended the boundary Hades guarded. It existed on both sides simultaneously, refusing to be contained by the distinction between living and dead. Persephone, listening from her throne, felt each word like a hand touching old wounds. She knew what it meant to be taken, to be dragged from light to darkness against her will. Her own mother Demeter still mourned her for half of every year, and the whole world died in sympathy, winter spreading across the earth in response to a mother's grief. She understood separation, understood the violence of being ripped from everything familiar. When Orpheus sang of Eurydice stolen by death, Persephone heard echoes of her own abduction, her own bride price paid in pomegranate seeds that bound her to this realm. She glanced at her husband and saw something she had never seen before. Hades sat motionless on his throne, but his face had changed. The eternal patience had cracked, and beneath it rose something raw and ancient. His eyes, which had witnessed the death of every mortal who ever lived, which had seen every form of suffering and loss, had begun to gleam with moisture. A single tear formed, gathered, and fell from the face of Death himself. It struck the arm of his throne with a sound like a bell tolling in an empty temple. The god of the underworld was weeping. Orpheus brought his song toward its close, but he did not end on despair. Instead, he sang of hope, fragile and necessary as a candle flame in vast darkness. He sang that even gods can be moved, that no law is so fixed it cannot bend to love's necessity, that mercy is not weakness, but the highest form of strength. He sang a question without asking it directly. Let the music itself pose the inquiry. Would death, this once, relent? Would the impossible be granted? Could love prove stronger than the oldest boundary? The final note hung in the air, sustained impossibly long, then faded into a silence deeper than any that had come before. Every shade, every spirit, every damned soul in all the underworld held whatever passed for breath in their insubstantial forms, waiting. Hades rose from his throne, and the movement was like a mountain standing up. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of his capitulation, the enormous gravity of a god doing what no god had done. He would grant the impossible. Eurydice would be released, allowed to follow Orpheus back to the living world, her death undone, the boundary violated in love's favor. Persephone's hand reached out and touched his arm, a gesture of approval, of solidarity. She too knew what it meant to love despite separation. But there was a price. There is always a price. The condition emerged from Hades, like something pulled from deep water, inevitable and terrible. Orpheus would walk back to the surface world, and Eurydice would follow behind him. But he must not look back at her. Not once. Not until both of them stood fully in the sunlight of the living world. Only when they had completely left his realm could Orpheus turn and see his wife restored. Until that moment, he must walk in faith alone, trusting that she followed, resisting every urge to verify her presence. One glance backward, Hades warned, and she would be lost forever. The deal would be void, the mercy revoked. She would return to death, and this time the boundary would seal absolutely. No song, no matter how beautiful, would move him twice. Orpheus, trembling with joy and terror, accepted. How could he not? The impossible had been granted. His song had moved the unmovable, had drawn tears from death itself, had stopped all torment in the realm of endless punishment. Surely he could manage this one simple thing. Surely his love was strong enough to walk forward without looking back. The Furies watched him go, their eyes still wet with unprecedented tears. The shades of the dead parted before him as he began his ascent. And behind him, invisible, inaudible, came Eurydice, released from death, following her husband toward the light. The fatal condition had been set. The doom was already in motion. The first step away from the throne of Hades feels like walking into a void. Orpheus moves forward, his lyre clutched against his chest, still trembling from the song that shattered the silence of the underworld. Behind him, There should be footsteps. There should be the whisper of fabric against stone, the soft intake of breath, some sign, any sign, that Eurydice follows. But there is nothing. Only the hollow echo of his own sandals against the obsidian floor. Hades had spoken the condition with cruel precision. You may lead her back to the world of light, but you must not turn to look upon her until you both stand beneath the sun. One glance before that moment, and she returns to me forever. The god's words had been clear, absolute, wrapped in the cold authority of one who has witnessed eternity. Persephone had nodded, her eyes holding something that might have been pity or might have been foreknowledge of doom. And Eurydice, had she heard these terms? He had glimpsed her only for a heartbeat before he was commanded to turn away, to begin this impossible ascent. Her face had been pale as marble, her eyes wide with hope and fear intermingled. Now he walks, and the silence behind him is a living thing that feeds upon his certainty with every passing moment. The tunnel slopes upward, carved from rock that seems to absorb all warmth, all comfort. The torches that line the walls burn with that strange underworld flame, purple and green, and somehow cold, casting shadows that move against the natural laws of light. Orpheus forces himself to maintain a steady pace, neither too fast nor too slow. Too fast and she might stumble, might fall behind, might be lost in the darkness. Too slow and his resolve will crumble. The need to verify her presence will overwhelm him. His fingers ache from gripping the lyre. The strings had wept such music before the throne, music that made even the Furies pause their eternal shrieking, that brought tears to the eyes of shades who had long forgotten what tears were. That music had won her back. But this silence, this terrible silence, might lose her forever. He strains to hear anything behind him. The underworld is never truly quiet. There are always the distant moans of the tormented, the whisper of the river Styx, the creaking of Charon's oar. But directly behind him, where Eurydice should be, there is an absence of sound so complete it feels deliberate, feels like a test designed with exquisite cruelty. What if she is not there? What if Hades lied? Gods lie. Gods deceive. The myths are full of their tricks and their games with mortal lives. What if this is simply another entertainment for the Lord of the Dead, to watch a grieving husband climb toward hope while following only empty air? The thought lodges in his mind like a thorn. Orpheus tries to force it away, but doubt is a poison that spreads. His pace falters for just a moment. If she is there, she would have noticed his hesitation. If she is there, the conditional torments him. He has only the word of Hades, a god whose very nature is death and darkness, and the keeping of souls that enter his realm. Why would such a god release one who had been claimed? Yes, the music had moved him, but gods are moved by mortal art the way humans are moved by the dance of insects. A momentary curiosity, nothing more. The tunnel continues upward, winding, turning. Orpheus navigates by the memory of his descent, that headlong rush into the earth following the thread of Eurydice's spirit to its final resting place. He had passed through caverns where the ceiling dripped with something that was not water, through passages lined with the reaching hands of those who died in longing, through the judgment hall where Minos and Rhadamanthus weighed souls on scales that measured truth against intention. All of it had been bearable because he was moving toward her. Now, moving away, supposedly with her following, the geography of the underworld seems designed to break him. Another 10 steps. Another 20. His breathing sounds loud in his own ears, ragged with the effort of climbing and the greater effort of not turning. What if she stumbles? The thought crashes into him with new force. Eurydice had been dead, had been a shade, insubstantial and weak. Has Hades restored her flesh fully? Can she manage this climb? What if even now she has fallen, is lying on the cold stone reaching out toward his retreating back, unable to call out because the rules of this cruel bargain seal her voice as well as her footsteps? He would never know. He would emerge into sunlight alone and only then discover he had abandoned her in the darkness. Sweat runs down his temples despite the chill. The muscles in his neck ache from the effort of keeping his head fixed forward. It would be so easy to turn, just a glance, just to verify. But the terms were absolute. Not until you both stand beneath the sun. Both. Zalman. The word implies she is there, suggests that Hades spoke truly. Orpheus clings to this interpretation, like a drowning man clings to driftwood. Both means two. Both means she follows. But language, too, can be a trap. Gods are masters of words that mean something other than they promise. The grade of the tunnel increases. He is climbing more steeply now, using his free hand against the wall for balance. The rock is slick with moisture or something like moisture. In the underworld, nothing is quite what it seems. He passed a field of flowers on his descent, beautiful beyond measure, and only later understood they were blooming from the regrets of the dead, petals formed from chances not taken, and words not spoken. What if Eurydice becomes another such flower, rooted in this moment, blooming eternally from his failure to maintain faith? Faith. Ow. That is what this test demands. Absolute faith in the word of a god of death. Absolute trust that she follows when every sense screams that he is alone. Orpheus had never considered himself a man of faith. He believed in music, in the reality of strings vibrating in harmony, in the mathematical certainty of notes and scales. Faith is for priests and mystics. He is an artist. But now he must become something else, must transform doubt into certainty through pure will, must believe against all evidence that each step carries him closer to salvation rather than deeper into cruel deception. The tunnel begins to lighten. At first he thinks it is illusion, desperate imagination painting hope onto darkness. But no, the sickly purple flame of the underworld torches is gradually yielding to something else, a distant grayness that speaks of the upper world. How far? How many more steps must he endure? The exit could be 100 paces away or 1,000. Distance in the underworld does not follow the rules of the surface. He has heard of souls who walked for ages without progress and others who traversed vast regions in a single step. Geography here bends to the will of Hades and the weight of each traveler's guilt or grace. But the light is growing. This, at least, is not illusion. Orpheus feels his heart hammering against his ribs. So close now. If she has followed this far, surely she can manage the rest. Unless she has not followed at all. Unless every step has been taken in solitude while Hades and Persephone watch from their throne, amused at the mortal who climbs toward nothing. The image fills his mind with such vividness it becomes almost real. He can see them, the Dark King and his stolen queen, observing through some supernatural means, waiting for the moment when Orpheus emerges alone and realizes he has been played for a fool. He stops walking. The decision is not conscious. His body simply refuses to continue without knowing. The silence behind him is unchanged, which proves nothing. Everything depends on a leap of faith he is not certain he can make. If he turns now and she is there, he loses her. If he turns now and she is not there, at least he knows, at least he does not carry false hope into the sun. But the terms were clear. Not until you both stand beneath the sun. If he turns before that moment, even if she follows, the bargain breaks. Orpheus closes his eyes, though he faces forward. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he tries to sense her presence through means beyond hearing and sight. Does the air move differently when two people occupy a space rather than one? Can love itself be felt across a distance of a few paces? He reaches out with every sensitivity he possesses, listening not with ears but with soul. And there perhaps, or perhaps only in imagination, he feels something. A warmth at his back. A sense of accompaniment. Or is it merely the echo of his own desperate need? He opens his eyes and begins walking again. The light ahead is definitely growing. He can see the texture of the stone walls now, not by the false light of underworld flame, but by the genuine gray of pre-dawn or dusk, the real light of the surface world. His world. Their world, if she follows. Each step now is both victory and agony. He is so close. Closer with every heartbeat. The rules of the bargain tighten around him like chains. The nearer he comes to success, the more unbearable the uncertainty becomes. What if the gods have lied? The question will not leave him. It circles through his mind, a vulture over carrion. Hades is not known for mercy. The underworld does not release what it has claimed. Every myth, every story speaks of the finality of death. Sisyphus tried to cheat it, and rolls his stone eternally. Tantalus grasps for escape and starves forever within reach of fruit and water. The dead do not return. And yet, Hades had seemed moved by the music. Persephone had wept. Even the three-headed Cerberus had lowered his massive heads and whimpered as the notes washed over him. Surely that had been real. Surely the bargain is genuine. But what if it is genuine, and she still does not follow? What if the terms were met, the permission granted, but Eurydice's shade was too weak to make the climb? What if she tries but cannot manage, grows fainter with each step, dissolves back into death, even as he marches confidently toward the light? He would be keeping his part of the bargain perfectly while she, through no fault of her own, fails to keep hers. The thought is almost worse than deception. To lose her not through godly cruelty, but through simple, tragic incapacity. The tunnel opens wider. He can see the mouth of it now, still distant but visible, a ragged circle of gray light like a wound in the darkness. Beyond that opening lies the world. Trees and sky and sun. The sun that is the final marker of the bargain's fulfillment. Not until you both stand beneath the sun. How long until he reaches it? Minutes. Moments? Each second stretches into eternity. His legs move mechanically, one step after another, while his mind fractures under the pressure of not knowing. He tries to remember her face from that brief glimpse before he turned away. She had been pale, yes, but present, solid enough to cast a shadow in the throne room's dim light. Her eyes had held recognition, had held love. That was real. He knows it was real. She knew him, wanted to return with him. If she had the strength to stand before Hades, she has the strength to follow. Unless the rules of the underworld sap that strength during the journey. Unless each step away from death's heart costs her more than it costs him. He is alive, warm-blooded, vital. She is newly reclaimed from death, perhaps only held in flesh by the thinnest of threads, a thread that might snap before they reach salvation. The grade levels out. He is close now, desperately close. The opening is perhaps 50 paces ahead, and beyond it, he can see the silhouette of branches against sky. Real sky. Surface world sky. His eyes, so long adjusted to darkness, begin to ache with the approaching light. 40 paces. 30. He wants to run, to sprint the final distance, and end this torture of uncertainty. But he forces himself to maintain the steady pace. If she follows, he must not lose her through haste. If she follows, the conditional will drive him mad. 20 paces from the opening, a new fear strikes him. What if the threshold itself is unclear? What if the boundary between underworld and surface is not the visible opening, but something beyond it? How far must he go to ensure they both stand beneath the sun? The sun itself is not visible, hidden behind clouds or trees, or the angle of the cave mouth. Must he see the sun directly? Must he feel its warmth? The terms of the bargain, which seemed so clear in the throne room, now reveal themselves to be potentially ambiguous. Not until you both stand beneath the sun could mean many things. The actual sun, visible in the sky, or merely outside the underworld, or truly in direct sunlight, which might require walking until he finds a clearing. 10 paces. The air changes, becomes warmer, carries the scent of living things, of leaves and earth and growth. Orpheus drinks it in, feels it like wine after long thirst. He is almost there. Almost free. They are almost free if she follows. If she has followed every step of this terrible journey. 5 paces. He can see individual leaves on the branches outside. Can see a bird, a living bird, shift its weight from one foot to another. The simplest miracle of life, and it brings tears to his eyes. 3 paces. Chaperon. And then he cannot bear it anymore. The uncertainty becomes a physical weight crushing his chest. What if he steps into the light and turns to find himself alone? What if he has climbed in solitude while she remained below, unable to call out, unable to stop him? Better to know now. Better to see her and lose her than to never know if she was there at all. The logic seems irrefutable in this moment. One glance just to verify. He is so close. Surely close enough. Surely, the gods would not be so precise, so cruel, as to measure the final few steps. Orpheus turns. And she is there. Eurydice is there. just 2 paces behind him, her face tilted up toward his. For one instant, one perfect, terrible instant, relief floods through him like sunlight. She followed. She was there all along. Every step of faith had been justified. Her face shows the same relief, the same overwhelming love. Her lips begin to form his name. And then, her expression changes. Relief curdles into understanding. Love transforms into betrayal, into horror. Her eyes, which had been locked on his with such devotion, now fill with terror. She sees what he has done. She understands that he has turned too soon, that the mouth of the cave is still 1 pace behind him, that the sun does not yet touch his skin. Her mouth opens wider, but no sound emerges, or if it does, it is drowned in the sudden rushing wind that rises from the depths behind her. He reaches for her, lunging forward, but his hands close on empty air. She is already fading, becoming translucent, her solid form dissolving back into shade. The force that pulls her is irresistible, a tether snapping her back to the realm of death with violent speed. He can see through her now, can see the tunnel behind her, can see her becoming less real with every fraction of a second. Her hand stretches toward him in a gesture that is both reaching and farewell. Her lips move. He hears the word, or perhaps only reads it in the shape of her fading mouth. Farewell. Not a curse, not an accusation. Simply farewell, a goodbye that will last forever. And then she is gone, ripped backward into the darkness as if she had never been, as if the last few minutes of hope had been nothing but fever dream. The tunnel behind him is empty. The silence is absolute. She's gone, and this time there will be no second chance, no reprieve, no song beautiful enough to move the heart of Hades again. Orpheus stands at the threshold, 1 foot still in the underworld, 1 in the land of the living. The sun breaks through the clouds at that moment, spills over his face with warmth that feels like mockery. He has lost her, not through godly deception, not through any fault but his own. The doubt that poisoned his faith has poisoned everything. He could not trust, could not believe. And in that failure of faith, in that single backward glance, he has condemned her to the darkness forever and himself to a life that will be nothing but the memory of her face in that final instant. Love turning to loss, hope turning to eternal separation. The turn was so slight, he barely noticed it at first. This man who had crossed the threshold between life and death twice in as many days. Orpheus emerged from the cave mouth that led back to the living world alone, and the sunlight that touched his face felt like an accusation. He had looked back. After everything, after the impossible had been granted, after Hades himself had softened, after Persephone had wept at his songs, he had turned his head and watched the woman he loved dissolve into shadow once more. Not taken by illness this time, not stolen by serpent's venom, but lost because he could not master his own terror and need for just 1 more second. Lost because of him. The journey back through Greece passed like a fever dream. He walked roads he did not remember walking. He arrived somehow in Thrace, the wild northern country of his birth, though he could not have told you the route he took or how many days the journey consumed. Time had become meaningless, a river that flowed around him while he stood fixed in that single moment of turning. Always turning, always seeing her face as the understanding bloomed there, as she realized what he had done, as she opened her mouth to speak his name, 1 final time before the darkness pulled her down. The lyre still hung from his shoulder, that instrument that had charmed stones and rivers, that had silenced the howling shades of Tartarus, that had made even death pause in his eternal work. He hated it now. Hated the weight of it against his ribs, the way the strings sometimes caught the wind and hummed with accidental music, but he could not set it down. His fingers found the strings without his permission, and songs poured from his throat like blood from a wound that would not close. But these were not the songs that had made him famous throughout the ancient world. Gone were the hymns to beauty, the celebrations of love's triumph, the paeans to spring and harvest, and the joy of living. Orpheus sang only grief now. He sang dirges that made the very trees seem to bow with sorrow. He sang laments so piercing that shepherds in distant fields would stop their work and weep without knowing why. He sang loss and emptiness, and the specific agony of having held salvation in his hands, and crushed it through his own weakness. The people of Thrace whispered about him as he wandered their wild hills and dense forests. They saw him as a ghost himself, this thin figure in travel-stained robes who appeared at forest edges at dawn, who sat beside cold streams singing to the water as it passed. Some recognized him, remembered the golden youth who had left years before with music on his lips and confidence in his step. That Orpheus was dead. This creature who had returned was something else entirely, hollowed out, and filled only with the echo of what he had lost. He rejected all human contact with a completeness that bordered on madness. When villagers approached with offerings of food, he fled into deeper wilderness. When old friends called his name, he did not turn, could not turn, would never turn again. The act of turning had destroyed his world. He moved only forward now, or sat in stillness, but never allowed himself to look back at anything, anyone. The irony would have been amusing if he had been capable of humor anymore. Women found him fascinating, this broken musician with his songs of beautiful sorrow. Something in that suffering called to them, made them want to heal him, or hold him, or perhaps just possess a piece of that profound emotion. But Orpheus had no love left to give. His capacity for human connection had been torn out by the roots in that tunnel beneath the earth. He did not simply reject their advances, he seemed not to register them at all, as if he had gone blind to anything that was not his grief. The Maenads noticed him first. These were the wild women who followed Dionysus, the god of wine and ecstasy and the breaking of boundaries. They roamed the mountains in frenzied groups, intoxicated by more than wine, caught up in states of religious madness that gave them strength beyond mortal limit. They danced until they bled, sang until their voices shattered, tore living animals apart with their bare hands in sacrifice to their god. They recognized no law except the will of Dionysus, no restraint except the limits of their physical forms. And they desired Orpheus with an intensity that matched their worship. Perhaps it was his beauty, which even grief could not entirely erase. Perhaps it was the challenge he represented, this man who would not be touched, who remained locked inside his mourning like a fortress. Perhaps it was simply that in their ecstatic worship of life and sensation and the wild present moment, they found his absolute dedication to death and memory an insult to everything they held sacred. They approached him in groups, crowned with ivy and leopard skins draped across their shoulders, moving with the predatory grace of hunting cats. They offered themselves with a frankness that would have shocked ordinary society. They danced for him, sang for him, promised him pleasures that would drown his sorrow in sensation. They offered him the gift of Dionysus, the ability to lose himself in the moment and forget the past that consumed him. Orpheus turned them away, not with anger or even acknowledgement, but with the absolute indifference of a man who had already died in every way that mattered. He simply looked through them as if they were spirits, incorporeal and irrelevant, then returned to his song. His rejection was so complete it went beyond insult into something worse, a negation of their very existence. The Maenads were not accustomed to rejection. Women who danced in the wild places, who knew their own power and divinity, who could tear bulls apart when the god's frenzy was upon them, they did not beg for any man's attention. Yet they returned to Orpheus again and again, drawn by something they could not name. Perhaps they wanted to heal him. Perhaps they wanted to break him further. Perhaps the distinction no longer mattered. Some say he made a fatal error beyond simple rejection. Some claim he spoke against their god, that in his grief and anger at the divine powers that had dangled hope before him, only to snatch it away, he renounced Dionysus entirely. Others whisper that he encouraged the men of Thrace to abandon the worship of the wine god, to reject the Maenads' wild rites in favor of Apollo's more ordered ceremonies. Whether this is true or simply a story told afterward to justify what came next, no one can say with certainty. What is certain is that the Maenads' desire curdled into rage. It happened during one of their sacred rites, when the wine flowed freely and the drums beat like the pulse of the earth itself, when the barriers between human and divine, wore thin and Dionysus moved among his followers, wearing their flesh like a garment. They found Orpheus in a clearing by the river Hebrus, sitting on a flat stone with his lyre in his hands, singing one of his endless mourning songs to the indifferent water. The attack began with screaming, that high, ululating cry that was both human and something beyond human. The Maenads burst from the tree line like a storm-made flesh, hands already shaped into claws, mouths twisted with a fury that partook of the divine. They fell upon him like waves on a shore, determined to break what would not bend. But here the old magic stirred one final time. As their hands reached for him, Orpheus sang, not a song of grief this time, but something older, wilder, a music that predated words and touched the core of what it meant to be alive. The stones themselves seemed to lean toward him. The trees bent their branches as if to shield him. Even the Maenads faltered, their rage momentarily suspended by the sheer beauty of what they heard. Then the drums began again, louder now, drowning out the lyre's voice. The Maenads took up their own song, a counter-melody of chaos and holy madness. They beat their drums and clashed their cymbals and stamped their feet until the earth shook, until even Orpheus's supernatural music could not compete with the sheer volume of their frenzy. When his song could no longer be heard, his protection failed. They tore him apart with their bare hands. The details have been softened by time, and the reluctance of those who recorded them to speak too plainly of such horror. But the accounts agree on the essential savagery. The Maenads did not simply kill Orpheus. They dismembered him, limb from limb, in a fury that went beyond violence into something ritualistic. Some say they used farming tools, Darcian knives, but others insist it was done with hands and teeth alone, that the god's madness gave them the strength to tear human flesh like parchment. His limbs they scattered across the fields. His body they left for the wild animals. But his head, severed from his shoulders in one terrible wrench, they threw into the river Hebrus. And here, the final impossibility occurred, the last strange grace of a life defined by crossing boundaries that should not be crossed. The head continued to sing. As it floated downstream, bobbing in the current with the lyre drifting beside it, still clutched in the detached hand, witnesses on the riverbank swore they could hear it. Not screaming, not crying out in agony, but singing. Singing the same songs of loss and longing that had defined his years of wandering. Singing Eurydice's name over and over like a prayer or a curse. The lyre, impossibly, still played, its strings plucked by dead fingers guided by something beyond mortal will. The head and the lyre floated all the way down the Hebrus to the sea, then across the waves to the island of Lesbos, singing the entire journey. The fishermen who found them on the beach were too terrified to touch them at first. They buried the head in a grove sacred to Dionysus, and some say that for years afterward, prophecies would emerge from that place, Orpheus's voice continuing to speak truths from beyond death. But why did it happen? The ancient writers themselves could not agree, and their uncertainty has echoed down through the millennia. Was it punishment for spurning Dionysus? The god of wine and ecstasy was known for terrible vengeance against those who rejected his worship. King Pentheus had been torn apart by his own mother in Dionysian frenzy for a similar rejection. Perhaps Orpheus's death was simply another example of the god's wrath, a reminder that some powers will not be denied. Or was it the simpler, more human story of scorned women taking revenge? The Maenads had offered themselves and been treated as invisible, worthless, beneath notice. In a world where women's power was so often constrained and controlled, perhaps they reclaimed it in the most violent way possible, punishing the man who had dared to look through them as if they did not exist. Some see a darker justice at work, a cosmic balancing. Orpheus had attempted to cheat death itself, to steal back what the fates had claimed. He had violated the natural order, crossed boundaries between life and death that were meant to remain inviolate. Perhaps his gruesome end was simply the universe correcting an imbalance, exacting payment for his transgression. He had tried to bring the dead back to life, so he was killed in a way that blurred the line between living and dead, his severed head singing on after death, just as he had sung his way through death before. And there is a final irony that the ancient poets did not fail to note. Orpheus had mourned because death had separated him from Eurydice. He had journeyed to the underworld to reclaim her, failed and spent years in grief because he could not join her in death. But now, torn apart by the Maenads, he was finally dead. His shade would descend to the realm of Hades just as all shades must. And there, somewhere in those dim fields where the dead wander, Eurydice's shade also walked. Would they find each other in that place? Would Hades and Persephone, moved by pity or perhaps cosmic humor, allow the two shades to embrace at last? Or would they be kept forever apart, eternal punishment for the man who had dared to look back? The myths fall silent here. We are not told. Perhaps the gods themselves debated it, unable to decide if this story should end in reunion or eternal separation. All we know is this: Orpheus died singing, as perhaps he had always been meant to do. His music outlasted his body, his grief proved stronger than death itself, and his story became a warning about the terrible price of love that refuses to accept loss. He would not let go of what was already gone, and it destroyed him completely. But even destruction could not silence his voice. Even torn apart and scattered, he continued to sing. That is the power and the curse of grief. It survives everything. It outlasts the body that contains it. And sometimes it becomes all that remains. 3,000 years have passed since the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice first entered human consciousness, and still we cannot let it go. We tell it again and again, in poems and operas, in films and songs, in whispered conversations about love and loss. But here is the truth that we circle around, afraid to name directly. This story haunts us not because it's beautiful, not because it speaks of mythic powers or divine mysteries. It haunts us because it reveals something unbearable about the nature of grief itself. It tells us that some losses cannot be undone, that some doors, once closed, should never be reopened, and that the very intensity of our love can become the instrument of our deepest destruction. We stand now at the threshold of understanding, 3 millennia later, and we must ask ourselves the question that Orpheus could never answer. Was his backward glance truly a moment of weakness, a failure of faith in the final test? Or was it something far more troubling, something that reveals the impossible architecture of human longing? Consider the possibility that his turn was not weakness, but unconscious self-sabotage, the soul's refusal to accept a gift it knows to be poison. What kind of life awaited them in the upper world? What marriage could survive the knowledge that one partner had died, that the other had descended into the land of shades, that their reunion rested not on natural law, but on divine whim? Perhaps in that instant before he turned, Orpheus understood something that the gods themselves had designed into their cruel bargain, that Eurydice returned would never be Eurydice as she was, that the woman walking behind him in the darkness was already changed by death, already half belonging to the underworld, already impossible to truly hold. Or consider an even stranger mercy in that fatal glance. For one perfect moment, as his eyes met hers in the shadows, Orpheus had his wife back completely. Not the memory of her, not the hope of her, but her living presence, her eyes looking into his with recognition and love. One perfect moment of reunion, crystalline and absolute, before she vanished forever. Would that single instant of certainty not be worth more than a lifetime of wondering? A lifetime of looking at her face across the breakfast table and asking silently, "Are you real? Are you truly here? Or are you some shade the gods have given me, some beautiful deception to torment me with proximity to what I've lost?" In choosing to look, perhaps Orpheus chose one moment of truth over decades of doubt, one genuine reunion over a marriage built on the quicksand of divine intervention. But here we arrive at the central mystery, the question that refuses resolution. Did Orpheus fail the test? Or was the test itself designed to be impossible from the very beginning? Did the gods, in their ancient wisdom and their casual cruelty, simply know human nature too well? They who had watched mortals for eons, who understood every tremor of the human heart, every weakness of the flesh, every limit of faith and endurance. They knew that no one who loves could walk that path without turning. They knew that doubt would accumulate with every step, that the silence behind him would grow unbearable, that eventually, inevitably, the need to know would overcome the command to trust. The test was not a genuine offer of redemption, but a final, exquisite torment, the gods watching to see exactly when and how the human would break under the weight of impossible conditions. They gave Orpheus hope precisely so they could watch it shatter. This is what disturbs us most deeply, what we recognize in our bones, even if we cannot speak it. Some loves are too powerful for this world. They exceed the capacity of mortal life to contain them. They burn too bright, demand too much, need what cannot be given. And when such loves meet loss, when death tears them apart, perhaps there is no force in heaven or earth that can truly restore what has been broken. Not because the gods lack power, but because the restoration itself would require both lovers to be less than they are, to love less fiercely, to need each other less completely. The very thing that made Orpheus turn, that depth of desperate love, was also the thing that made reunion impossible. You cannot love someone that much and also walk calmly forward, trusting in divine promises, refusing to verify their presence. The love that moved Hades himself was too strong to pass the test that Hades demanded. And so we are left with grief that cannot end, loss that will not heal. After Eurydice vanished the second time, after the Bacchae tore Orpheus to pieces in their frenzy, the gods placed his lyre among the stars. It hangs there still, the constellation Lyra, shining in the northern sky, its strings vibrating with songs that never cease. Even in death, even dismembered and scattered, Orpheus continues his lament. The music goes on, mournful and perfect. A song of loss that circles the earth every night, that will play across eternity until the stars themselves go dark. This is not comfort. This is the opposite of comfort. This is the truth the myth whispers in our ears, that some griefs are eternal, that some loves mark us so deeply that even death cannot end their claim on us, that the most profound experiences of human connection leave wounds that will never close, that should never close because to heal completely would be to forget what mattered most. Orpheus could not stop singing his loss. We cannot stop telling his story. We are all walking that dark path, hoping against hope that what we've lost might somehow be restored, knowing that if we turn to look, we will lose everything, and knowing equally that we will turn. We must turn, because love demands it, because human nature permits nothing else. The lyre plays on in the darkness between stars, and we listen, and we understand. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.